This is Ralph Sass, and this is the lecture for Chapter 2. In reality, Chapter 2 and 3 really go together. They're both dealing with job order costing, what have you. So the quiz is just one over both chapters. So just kind of keep that in mind, that really when you think of Chapter 2, they're not discrete topics, but 2 and 3 go together. This lecture might be a little long, but it's all going to be done in one. So let's go ahead and get started. The first thing to realize is that there are two different types of costing systems used for very different type of organizations. We would use process costing in a company that produces many units of a single product. So we're going to use process costing for things like the paints, the company that makes paints or what have you. And the reason is or the Coke plant that's bottling the Coke, or the water plant. Why? Because one unit of product is indistinguishable from other units of product. They all look alike as they're coming off the assembly line, so because of that we're going to use process costing. What this chapter and the next chapter talk about are what we call job order costing, and this is where many different products are produced each period. Okay? Products are manufactured to order, and each one requires tracing of costs. If you ever go and work in a law firm or something like that, they trace every cost to a particular lawsuit or particular client. If you go to work for a company like a construction company that builds decks, they're going to keep track of the costs for that particular deck or that particular bathroom addition or whatever they're doing. Those are all good examples of where you would use job order costing. Okay, so job order costing is going to be where there are a lot of different jobs are worked and costs are going to be accumulated based upon the job. In process, it's going to be a single product and it's going to be collected based upon the department. Okay, so if we're looking at job order costing, what's going to do it? I already talked about lawyers' offices, architect offices. Every building design, what have you, is going to be different. Catering for a wedding reception. Every wedding reception is going to be different and have different costs. The builder of commercial fishing vessels are all going to be have different criteria, different things added, so they're all going to be different. On the other hand, Heinz ketchup, which is not job order costing but would be process costing, every jar of Heinz ketchup that's coming off the assembly line looks exactly like the one before it and the one after it. So what we're going to do in job order costing is we're going to still have direct material, direct labor, and manufacturing overhead. And the direct material and direct labor we're going to put onto each of the jobs, okay, as we complete the job. So, you know, when we send out 10 loads of lumber or whatever for the building the deck, we're going to mark off that we sent out 10 loads of lumber to that particular job site. And then what we're going to do is the manufacturing overhead, the nails. I am not going to keep track of how many nails I put in to the remodel job, okay? That's going to be part of manufacturing overhead. I may keep I would keep track of the number of pieces of wood or the number of pieces of drywall, but I'm not going to keep track of the number of nails. I'm not going to keep track of the number of glue. So what we're going to do is we're going to take those indirect materials, we're going to add them to indirect labor, and we're going to allocate them to jobs, okay, based upon some rate. And we're going to talk about how to calculate that rate here in a couple of minutes. So each job is going to have a job order cost sheet of some kind. This is one example. Today they're all online, what have you, but these are some of the things that it's going to have. In this case, it's got a job number, what have you, the date it started, and things like that. And then as they request lumber, or whatever it is in this case it appears to be lumber, they're going to fill out some sort of a requisition form to go into the warehouse and take it. Okay, and notice they took, you know, and they've got the number of feet there, how many they took, what the cost was, and what that's going to all show up is that's all going to show up on this job cost And notice the requisition number is $68.90. The total was $116. How much direct materials am I putting onto this product, onto this job at this point? $116. Then what I do is all the employees have a time ticket, and a lot of times, like if you go into a law firm office, whatever, they will keep track of how much of their 8-hour day they spent on each job. And so in this particular case, this particular individual spent 8 hours. His rate's $11 an hour, so he spent $88. He's marked down there that he's done this on job A143, and so that's all going to show up here. Once again, number of hours, 8 hours, $11 an hour. It's $88 an hour, so that's my direct labor. Now I've got to decide how much overhead I'm going to apply. And in order to apply overhead, what we need to have is some base, okay? And overhead is going to be applied to jobs, okay? And we're going to use some sort of an allocation base, such as direct labor hours, perhaps labor dollars. If you see labor dollars, it's usually as a percentage, okay? Or sometimes it'll be machine hours. Could be a whole bunch of other things. We'll talk about other cost drivers in a later chapter. Those are the big ones that we're going to use here early on. Direct labors, hours, direct labor dollars, or machine hours. Keep in mind, if it's a percentage, it might be 120% of the direct labor dollars. And so what you would do is take the direct labor hours, $10 an hour perhaps, multiply it by 1.20, and you get $12 in manufacturing overhead. 120% converts to 1.2 when you convert it as a decimal. So that's how we would go ahead and do that. Okay. Why do we use allocation base? We use it because it is, I would argue, not difficult. I would argue the reason, if we can trace it, we trace it. Okay. But it's impossible to trace everything to a particular job. It's impossible to know how much glue they used or how many nails they used on and it wouldn't be worthwhile for them to count the number of nails they used on a particular job site. Okay. Keep in mind it also consists of a lot of different items. You know, it could be the salary of the supervisor as well as the greaser, the nails, or whatever else. Okay. And notice there's a lot of things where overhead costs are fixed even though output fluctuates. You may have the supervisor on a salary, okay, and he may be supervising 4 different job sites. How do you allocate his salary, okay, between those 4 job sites? You're going to have to do it based upon, you know, cost of the job, direct labor hours, maybe how much money was spent hiring labor. You're going to have to find some way to go ahead and allocate those dollars. So what you need to come up with is a predetermined overhead rate. And to calculate that predetermined overhead rate, and a couple of things, it is done, first off, before the period begins. I used to often get a call in October or September or even August and say, how much do you think it's going to cost next year for this? And it's like, part of me wanted to say, how the heck do I know what it's going to cost a year from now for this particular product or whatever else? The reason why they needed that is because they needed to come up with some sort of estimate of the total manufacturing overhead cost for next year. So before the year starts, they have to come up with and put all those costs up there for what those costs are. And then they have to estimate the total number of units that we're going to produce. How many decks am I going to build? Or how many labor hours? Or how many machine hours is the machine going to work? Notice, there's an estimate going into the top. There's an estimate going into the bottom. So this predetermined overhead rate is quite simply the best guess for how much I'm going to use next year based upon some rate. Okay, there were a lot of estimates that are going into this. Okay, ideally, that allocation base is the cost driver. Ideally, it's what drives the cost. Okay, if I were doing, for example, decks, I would probably go by labor hours. Okay, for my manufacturing overhead. Why? Because for every labor hour out there, I can approximate, perhaps, and how many nails they use, is probably determined based on how long they are working on the job, more so than anything else. So what I want to do is I want to find out what drives that cost, and I want to use that as my allocation base. The reason why we use this is it makes it possible to estimate the total jobs costs sooner. It also gives us a way to go out when somebody asks for a quote. We can go out and give a quote and have a pretty good idea on what it's going to cost for us to actually build that deck or whatever else. Note, this is an important note, actual overhead costs for the period are not going to be known. I'm going to have to quote this beforehand, make an estimate of what my costs are going to be, and I'm not going to know what my actual costs are till later. Okay? So what we need to do to calculate those overhead rates is the first thing we need to do, oops, sorry about that. First thing we need to do, estimate how much we're going to produce during that upcoming period. How many decks are we going to build next year? How many labor hours are we going to use? Then we have to estimate the total amount of the allocation base. Okay, and then we have to figure out what all our costs are going to be. So let's take a look at this. Okay, and this is very common for how a firm would go about doing something like this. They think that next year, i.e. the upcoming period, they're going to use 160,000 direct labor hours. The company estimate that its fixed costs are going to be 200 grand, and its variable costs in this case are 275 per labor hour. So notice what they're going to do. They're going to take the 200 grand, add that to 275 times the number of direct hours they're working, and that's 440 grand. Take the two of those together, and that's 640 grand on my estimated manufacturing overhead. Divide it by 160,000, which are my direct labor hours, and I get a rate of $4 per hour. Okay, I get a rate of $4 per direct labor hour. There are other ways to do this. In the video where I go over the quizzes, I will show you some of the ways to, some alternative ways sometimes to do some of these. Okay? So, what have we just done? We've taken that predetermined overhead rate, divided it by the actual amount of activity we expect, and then we go ahead and apply it. In this particular case, okay, we're doing it based upon direct labor hours, so that's 8. There's my rate of 4. So how much money do I put onto this job? I put $32 of manufacturing overhead to cover supervision, nails, glue, you know, what have you. Most law firms even go so far as to keep track of the number of copies that I print for a particular job, and it would not be unheard of to charge you $10 or $15. 10 cents or whatever per copy that your job requires. So notice in this case then they take and they summed up the total cost. In this case it's $236. Okay, by adding all those numbers, notice they made 2 of them. It required 2 units to be produced, so they took the 236, divided it by 2, and the unit product cost is $118. Notice that is just the product cost. If I charge $118, I will lose money. I have to include some additional margin for my selling, general, and administrative expenses. So at this point, I can't charge that $118. I don't want anyone to think that $118 then is the cost, or I should say it's the cost to produce it. But if I charged that amount, I will lose money. Okay. Notice that, and this often causes confusion, that average unit cost, and many people misinterpret it, should not be interpreted as the cost that would actually be incurred if I produce an additional unit. If I produce an additional unit, will it cost me another $118? And the answer quite simply is no. Okay. Why not? because we've got fixed overhead that would not change if another unit was produced. So the incremental cost of producing another unit is going to be less than 118 bucks. Okay, so we have to be careful in how we interpret some of these numbers. So notice what we have here, just to kind of see how this works. We have, in this particular case, we required 200 hours of direct materials, $10 of direct labor hours at 15 bucks an hour. Total overhead for the year was estimated at 760 grand. Direct labor hours were 20 grand. Notice what they're going to do is they're going to ask for what's the cost of the job. Well, the cost of the job is, first we have to figure out the overhead, the predetermined overhead rate. 760 divided by 20 is 38 bucks. And that's $38 per direct labor hour. So then we take our direct materials. We take our direct labor. It was $15 an hour at 10 hours. It's 150 bucks. Our manufacturing overhead is $38 an hour at 10 hours, or 380. Total cost for the job is $730. One other quick note, overhead costs have become a bigger and bigger percentage of overall costs, so it is not at all unheard of to see manufacturing overhead be a larger number than, even in this case, direct labor rates. Okay. Some companies have multiple rates. It would not be unheard of to have multiple rates. The reason why you would do this is you may have two different production departments, what have you. Okay. And so what you may find is that it makes sense to have one rate, in this case per machine hour, and another one by direct labor hour. Okay. And so that would not at all be unheard of to have multiple rates for different departments or what have you. Okay, and then notice if we, okay, in this case we've got some information. Don't know why it's a little bit convoluted like this, but first thing we need to do is to calculate the predetermined overhead rates. So they took the 390 for the milling department. They took the 390,000, which were their fixed costs, which are right there. Notice they have fixed costs, third item down, 390 and a half a million. Okay, so they took the 390, then added the variable overhead costs, the $2 per man hour and 375, or pardon me, machine hour, and the 375 by the direct labor hour. And that's going to provide them with the total costs, okay, for next year. Then what they need to do is divide that by how many machine hours or labor hours they're actually going to use. In this case, 60,000 and 80,000. And what that gives them is that gives them the rate, and those are the overhead rates, $8.50 per machine hour, $10 per direct labor hour. Now they can go ahead and take a look at the job, okay? And notice in this particular case, the job, 407, used various amount of machine hours and direct labor hours. They had direct materials and they had direct labor, okay? So notice the milling department used 90 hours at $850, and the assembly department, okay, used 20 direct labor hours at 10 for $200. Okay, notice the fact that they used the machine hours, and those are probably going to be irrelevant. Okay, so they take the direct materials. They take the direct materials. For each of they take the direct labor, then they take the manufacturing overhead, and that becomes the total job. Now there are some cases, just kind of a quick note here, in this particular case, they only took the 90 times the 850 and the 20 times 10. There may be some situations where, okay, we're going to see later on where we may multiply those out, especially in activity-based costing. For purposes of this, they used milling, okay, was using machine hours, and so if you had no machine hours, or if you had the direct labor hours, you kind of ignore that. And assembly had direct labor hours, not machine hours, so you ignore that. But we are going to find out in activity-based costing there are times where you may use some of those numbers in a slightly different way. Okay? Now notice the selling price in this particular case of the job. In this particular case, they assume a 75% markup, and that would not be at all be unheard of. And so notice what happens. They take the total cost, multiply it by 75%, add that together to come up with the total cost for the product. Another way to get there is to take the 2,485 times 1.75. Why 1.75? Because that'll be 175%. That'll be the 100% of the cost plus my 75% markup. That'd probably be the way I would have done it. Either way, you're going to get to that $4,348. My point here is notice that the job costs are much higher, or pardon me, the sales price is much higher than the job costs, and it needs to be in order to be profitable and make money. One last item for this chapter is each job is going to have their own sheet. So you are going to have, thinking back to last semester, a subsidiary ledger with all your individual job sheets on them, and they're all going to be kept obviously on the computer in some computer file, but they all will be kept separate. And then when you complete a job, you'll throw it into a completed job file and file that away in case you have to pull it up for some other purpose, or in case the information will be useful for some other job. That concludes the lecture for Chapter 2. If you have any questions, please feel free to let me know. Thank you.